February 28, 1943, 11:47 p.m. 8 transport ships vanish into the darkness of the Bismarck Sea, carrying 6,900 Japanese soldiers packed into steel hulls like ammunition in a magazine. The admiral watching them disappear from his destroyer bridge already knows the math. His own staff told him to his face, "Half these men will not come home." Half. 3,450 human beings, calculated in advance as acceptable losses, written into the mission brief, initialed, stamped, and filed. He sails anyway. 36 hours later, American aircraft will arrive at wave-top height, below every radar, below every lookout, below the minimum elevation of every anti-aircraft gun on every Japanese warship in that formation. 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing 2,900 feet per second, will tear through bridge crews before a single warning can be transmitted. Skip bombs will bounce across the surface like stones on a pond and drive into hulls below the waterline. The oil from burning ships will catch fire on the surface of the ocean. Men who survive the initial hits will burn in the water they jumped into to escape. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, nearly 4,000 men dead in 45 minutes. And the man who made it possible was not a general. He was not an admiral. He was a 43-year-old commercial airline mechanic from New Mexico, whose wife and 4 children were sitting in a Japanese internment camp in Manila while he worked in a Brisbane hangar with salvaged parts, a welding torch, and the specific fury of a man who needed the war to end differently than it was currently going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community exists for exactly this kind of history. His name was Paul Gunn. He looked at a perfectly ordinary medium bomber, got angry about something personal, and rebuilt the entire logic of aerial warfare with a wrench. This is the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and it begins with a geometry problem that Japan could not solve in time. By early 1943, Japan's position in the Southwest Pacific was not collapsing suddenly. It was collapsing in slow motion, which is worse because everyone with a map can watch it happen and cannot stop it. The evacuation of Guadalcanal in February had been called a tactical repositioning in official communications. Nobody believed it. The Solomon Islands were gone. The strategic initiative that Japan had spent 2 years building had bled out across 6 months of attrition that Japanese planners had not modeled and could not reverse. What remained of Japan's offensive capacity in the region concentrated in New Guinea. The center of that position was a base complex on the northeastern coast called Lae. Lae was not optional. Lae was everything. The airfields at Lae supported the Zero fighters that defended Japanese positions across the Huon Peninsula. The harbor at Lae received the supplies and reinforcements that kept forward garrisons alive against Australian units pressing from the south. Without Lae, the Japanese position in New Guinea had no operational base within range of the actual fighting. Without Lae, the entire campaign begins contracting toward Madang and Wewak, positions so far from the front lines that they are strategically useless. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, understood this with the clarity that comes from watching your positions deteriorate in real time. Malaria rates in Japanese forward units were high enough that entire formations were combat ineffective before they ever encountered an Allied soldier. Men who are sick cannot fight. Men who are running out of ammunition cannot hold ground. The small boat and submarine routes being used to resupply Lae, since Allied air power made surface convoys dangerous, could move a fraction of the tonnage the garrison actually needed. The reinforcement was sitting in Rabaul, the 51st Division. Approximately 6,900 soldiers in transport ships in the harbor, waiting for the order to sail. Their commander had originally been told his men were going to Wewak, a safer route with thinner Allied air coverage. The deterioration at Lae changed that assignment. The men were redirected. The soldiers in the holds were not fully informed of the urgency that had produced this decision. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul ran the numbers before the convoy sailed. Their assessment was direct. A formation sailing from Rabaul to Lae, under current Allied air coverage with the 5th Air Force B-17S ranging the entire Bismarck Sea, could expect to lose approximately 50% of its strength. Half the transports. Half the men currently below decks. The order said sail. 50% losses were acceptable because the alternative was certain failure at Lae, which meant the loss of everything behind Lae as well. What nobody in the Japanese planning staff fully understood was that the math was already wrong before the convoy left the harbor. Because 200 kilometers south of Rabaul, in a hangar in Brisbane, Australia, a mechanic with personal reasons to care had already solved the geometry problem that Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine was built on. And the solution was so unconventional that his own commanders had spent 6 weeks trying to stop him from using it. Paul Gunn was 43 years old when America entered the war. Not a young hotshot pilot, not a general's favorite on a fast track. He was a former Navy aviator who had spent the 1930s flying commercial routes in the Philippines for Philippine Airlines. Stubborn, profane, technically brilliant in the specific way that comes from decades of making aircraft work in conditions where spare parts don't exist and failure means death. His family was in Manila when the Japanese invaded in January 1942. His wife Polly, 4 children. The city fell. His family went into the Santo Tomas internment camp. Gunn went to work for the 5th Air Force, flying whatever needed flying, fixing whatever needed fixing, and thinking about a problem that was getting American pilots killed with the urgency of a man whose personal stake in the outcome was locked in a cage 3,000 miles away. The problem was this: Japanese convoys were surviving. American B-17 dropping bombs from high altitude were hitting almost nothing because ships have time to maneuver when they can see the bombs falling from 20,000 feet. The hit rate for high-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships was approximately 6%. Not 6% below what was hoped. 6%. 1 bomb in every 16 found a ship. American torpedo planes were being destroyed before they could close to release range because torpedo runs require long straight approaches at low altitude, and a Zero fighter can identify a straight low-altitude approach from 2 miles and kill it before it reaches the convoy perimeter. The convoys were getting through. Garrisons were being resupplied. The war was continuing to go wrong, and Gunn was watching it from a hangar with a wrench in his hand and a very specific reason to need it to go differently. He focused on the B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber. In its standard configuration, a bombardier in the nose, a bomb bay, defensive turrets designed for medium-altitude attack against fixed targets, conventional, reasonable, against maneuvering ships with fighter cover, largely useless. What Gunn proposed stripped all of that out and replaced it with something that had never existed in military aviation before. Remove the bombardier position from the nose entirely. Pack that space with 4.50 caliber machine guns. Add 4 more in external positions on the fuselage sides. 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns, all aimed by pointing the aircraft directly at the target, turning the B-25 into something that required a completely new category. Not a bomber, not a fighter. A low-level gun platform that would come in at wave-top height, 4 degrees above the water, below the minimum depression angle of every heavy anti-aircraft gun on a Japanese warship. The approach logic was brutal in its simplicity. Japanese destroyer anti-aircraft architecture was built around threats arriving from above 30 degrees of elevation. The guns were physically designed to engage aircraft that come down from altitude. An aircraft arriving horizontally at 4 degrees above the surface is outside the mechanical range of every heavy gun in the formation. You cannot depress a gun below its mechanical stop. That is not a tactical problem. That is a physics problem. And physics problems cannot be trained away. While the B-25 runs came in at wave-top height, skip bombs would be released at close range. A skip bomb is exactly what it sounds like. A bomb delivered at low altitude and shallow angle that bounces across the water surface like a stone and drives into a ship's hull below the waterline, where damage control cannot stop the flooding fast enough. Delayed fuses. The explosions happen inside the hull. The keel breaks. The ship goes down. His superiors told him this was tactically suicidal, technically unproven, and contrary to established doctrine on 4 separate levels. The aircraft would be below radar, below lookouts, arriving at a speed and angle that convoy defensive training had never accounted for and could not account for because nothing like this had ever been done before. Gunn told them he needed a modified aircraft, a practice range over water, and 6 weeks. He got the aircraft. He worked in a Brisbane hangar with a small team and a motivation that the officers arguing doctrine with him did not share. He mounted the guns. He calculated the skip bombing release angles against ship hull profiles at wave-top approach speeds. He ran the math on what 8.50 caliber rounds per second at 2,900 feet per second would do to a bridge crew that had approximately 8 seconds of warning before the aircraft was past them. 8 seconds. That was the attack window. Not a minute. Not 30 seconds. 8 seconds from first gun contact to bomb release to the aircraft pulling off the target and climbing away. In 8 seconds, a ship that is maneuvering and fighting becomes a ship that is sinking. The math was not tactical. It was physics. Brigadier General Howard Ramey ran 5th Air Force bomber operations with the institutional confidence of a man who had written several of the manuals currently being ignored. He was not stupid. He was experienced in exactly the way that makes certain kinds of experience dangerous, because every lesson he had accumulated told him that medium bombers attack at medium altitude, that skip bombing was an unproven technique with unacceptable aircrew risk, and that sending pilots in at sea level against warships with anti-aircraft guns was not innovation. Gunn presented his data in February 1943. Ramey listened without interrupting, which Gunn later described as the most alarming 40 minutes of his professional life. Then Ramey said, "Captain, what you are describing is a tactic designed by a man who is emotionally compromised by his family's imprisonment and is therefore unable to evaluate risk objectively." Gunn stared at him for 3 seconds. "Sir, with respect, my emotional state has no effect on the hit rate data from the practice range. The guns cannot depress below 7 degrees elevation. Our approach angle is 4 degrees above the water. The geometry is not a theory, General. It is a physical constraint of Japanese naval anti-aircraft hardware." Ramey closed the folder. "You are not authorized to modify additional aircraft." Gunn walked out with 2 modified aircraft and 0 written authorization to build more. What saved the program was a phone call that Gunn should not have been able to make. General George Kenney commanded the entire 5th Air Force, and he had been watching the conventional approach fail long enough to want a reason to override his own subordinate. Gunn got 20 minutes with Kenney on a Tuesday evening through a contact who owed him a favor from a logistics situation in 1942 that neither man had documented officially. Kenney asked 2 questions. First, what is the minimum number of modified aircraft needed to make the tactic viable against a convoy of 8 to 12 ships with destroyer escort? Gunn said 16 minimum with coordinated Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighter suppression preceding each attack wave. Second, how long to modify 16 aircraft to operational standard? Gunn said 18 days with the right crews and parts. Kenney said, "You have the authorization. You do not have it in writing. If Ramey files a formal objection before the first operational deployment, I cannot protect you. Move quickly." 18 days. Gunn moved. The modifications happened at Charters Towers in northeastern Australia, far enough from Port Moresby that direct oversight was limited. 2 shifts. The nose guns required custom mounting brackets fabricated from materials not technically allocated to this project. The external fuselage mounts required modification of airframe sections that Boeing specifications did not cover. On day 11, the qualified welder on Gunn's team developed a hand infection. There was no time to wait for a replacement. Gunn personally welded 4 of the 16 mounting brackets himself. The test of the full modified squadron happened February 24, 1943, off the Queensland coast. Ramey sent 2 observers, Conditions were not ideal. Low cloud ceiling, moderate chop. Wind from the northeast at 18 knots pushing the skip bombing approach angle outside Gunn's original calculations. Gunn had recalculated the release parameters at 3 in the morning 2 days earlier and distributed the updated numbers to his crews. The 16 aircraft went in at wave top height. 6 Beaufighters preceded the first wave, opening with cannon fire on simulated anti-aircraft positions. Then the first B-25 wave closed. Then the second. Ramey's first observer wrote that from the observation vessel, he initially believed the run had failed, because the aircraft came in so low they appeared about to hit the water before reaching the target. They did not hit the water. The skip bombs bounced at precisely the angles Gunn's geometry had predicted. The strafing run preceding each bomb release destroyed every simulated gun position before the bomb hit. The hit rate across 16 aircraft against 8 simulated targets was 73%. The previous best achieved by conventional high-altitude B-17 attacks against similar target profiles was 6%. Ramey's second observer, a lieutenant colonel who had been skeptical in every prior meeting, walked to where Gunn was standing after the last aircraft pulled off and said nothing. He extended his hand. Formal authorization came 48 hours later. 16 aircraft, fully modified, trained crews cleared for operational deployment against Japanese convoy traffic in the Bismarck Sea. Ramey filed no objection. He filed instead a request to expand the modification program to an additional 12 aircraft. Kenny later described it as one of the most efficiently written reversals of position he had encountered in 20 years of military service. The training of additional crews began immediately. Immediately in a war zone with exhausted mechanics and a logistics chain not designed to support a completely new tactical method, meant the deployment timeline was dangerously tight. The crews who flew the practice runs were ready. The additional crews assigned to the program had 4 days of low-level approach training before intelligence from Rabaul confirmed a major convoy had departed for Lae. 4 days. Against a technique Gunn had spent 2 months perfecting. The weapon existed. The convoy was sailing. 6,900 men were in the water heading toward a geometry problem that had already been solved in a hangar where a man worked double shifts because his family was in a cage, and existing doctrine was not getting the war won fast enough. On March 2nd, a B-24 reconnaissance aircraft spotted Kimura's convoy through a break in the clouds. The 5th Air Force now knew the exact route, the exact timing, where the convoy would be on the morning of March 3rd. The modified B-25s were already airborne. In Part 2, we will see what happens when the Beaufighters arrive first at sea level and destroy the gun crews before the convoy knows what is coming. We will see what 8.50 caliber guns at 2,900 feet per second does to a bridge crew in 8 seconds. And we will see the moment Kimura's radar operators picked up high-altitude contacts from the south and ordered his gun crews to the wrong sky, because the real attack was coming from somewhere no Japanese doctrine had ever prepared them to look. In Part 1, Paul Gunn stripped a B-25 Mitchell down to its frame, packed 8.50 caliber machine guns into the nose, and proved at 73% hit rates that attacking Japanese convoys at wave-top height was not suicide. It was the only method that actually worked. General Kenny gave him verbal authorization. 16 modified aircraft were ready. The convoy had left Rabaul. But the weapon being ready and the weapon being trusted are 2 entirely different problems. And what was waiting for Gunn on the other side of that authorization was something the practice range data could not solve for him. Because while Gunn was welding brackets in Queensland, the Japanese were not standing still. They were reading the same reports from their convoy commanders that Allied intelligence was intercepting. They knew something had changed. They just didn't know what to do about it. In the 6 weeks before the Bismarck Sea engagement, Japanese convoy losses to modified B-25 attacks had increased by approximately 240% compared to the same period the previous year. That number was in Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's briefing documents at Rabaul headquarters. He initialed them. He convened an emergency staff review on February 26th. His gunnery officer took 12 minutes to deliver an answer that amounted to 4 words. There is no fix. Kusaka's problem was architectural. The anti-aircraft systems on his destroyer escorts were designed from the hull up to engage threats arriving from above 30 degrees of elevation. That was not a training gap. That was a production decision made in Japanese shipyards years before the war began. Retrofitting low-angle gun mounts capable of engaging sea-level threats would require dry dock time, fabricated parts not available at Rabaul, and a production schedule that did not exist. His fighters could theoretically intercept B-25s before they closed to release range, but a B-25 at wave-top height traveling at 250 miles per hour gave a zero approximately 11 seconds of viable intercept window. That window assumed the Zero was already at low altitude when the attack began. Zero patrol doctrine kept fighters at altitude. Changing the patrol pattern would reduce coverage against high-altitude B-17S while only partially addressing the low-level threat. Kusaka approved the convoy anyway. He modified the Zero patrol briefing to include lower patrol patterns, which was an adjustment to a defensive system that needed replacement rather than adjustment. He knew this. He sent 6,900 men to sea because Lae had to be held, and there was nothing else available. The math said acceptable losses were 50%. The math was already wrong, but Kusaka did not know that yet. What Kusaka did not know was that 8 days before the convoy sailed, a maintenance crisis had nearly grounded half of Gun's modified fleet before it ever reached combat. The external fuselage gun mounts fabricated at Charter's towers were developing stress fractures along the mounting bracket welds. Not all of them. 6 of the 16 aircraft showed hairline fractures after sustained low-level flying that the test program had not fully simulated. The vibration profile at wave-top height, combined with full gun firing loads, was creating stresses that Gun's original calculations had underestimated by a margin that nobody had caught until the aircraft were already in operation. 6 aircraft grounded, potentially more depending on what inspection found. Colonel Donald Hall, who commanded the 3rd Attack Group and had staked his professional reputation on deploying the modification in combat, walked into Gun's workspace at 5 in the morning on February 23rd and said 4 words. "Tell me it's fixable." Gun looked at the fracture data for 30 seconds. "Give me 48 hours and 3 welders who can work without stopping." "You have 36. The repair required reinforcing each affected bracket with a secondary weld plate. 14 additional pounds per mount. The added weight slightly altered the firing angle of the 2 outermost guns on each aircraft, which meant every skip bombing release parameter Gun had calculated and distributed to his crews was now wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that in combat, at wave-top height, at 250 miles per hour, with 8 seconds of attack window, wrong was enough to miss. Gun recalculated at 3 in the morning on February 25th. The revised parameters were distributed to crews the following day. The crews had approximately 1 day of practice flying with the new numbers before the convoy intelligence from Rabaul made the training timeline irrelevant. The formal test of the full modified squadron, the test that Ramey had sent observers to document, happened on February 24th off the Queensland coast. Conditions were not what Gun had planned for. Cloud ceiling at 1,800 feet. Moderate chop on the water. Wind from the northeast at 18 knots, which pushed the skip bombing approach angle outside the parameters Gun's original calculations had used. The recalculated parameters were what the crews were flying with. They had been flying with them for less than 48 hours. Ramey's 2 observers were positioned on a vessel 400 meters from the simulated target zone. Both had been in every prior meeting where Gun's concept had been discussed, and both had filed written skepticism about wave-top delivery against defended targets. One had described skip bombing in February as a technique derived from childhood physics with no operational application against modern naval defensive systems. He was standing on the observation deck with a notebook when the Beaufighters came through. 13 Beaufighters arrived from the southwest at 220 knots, sea level, below the radar horizon of every simulated escort position, below the visual horizon of every simulated lookout. They generated spray trails from their propellers across the surface of the water. The first observer later wrote that he heard the engines before he saw the aircraft, and by the time he identified the sound source, the Beaufighters were already past the outer defensive perimeter and opening fire. 20mm cannon. 4 cannons per aircraft. 13 aircraft. The simulated anti-aircraft positions on the outer defensive ring were marked by flags. The Beaufighters destroyed every flag on the first pass. Not most of them. Every one. The pass took 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, the outer defensive perimeter of a 12-ship convoy would have had its primary anti-aircraft crews killed or wounded before they could depress their guns to engage the threat coming behind the Beaufighters. Then the B-25s came. The first observer wrote that he initially believed the run had failed because the aircraft approached so low that they appeared to be going to hit the water before reaching the target. They did not hit the water. The first wave of 8 aircraft closed on the simulated destroyer screen at wave-top height, 4 degrees above the surface, moving at 250 miles per hour. The time between first visual identification from the observation vessel and bomb release was less than 9 seconds. The skip bombs bounced at precisely the angles guns' revised geometry had predicted, not the original calculations. The recalculated parameters from 3 in the morning on February 25th derived after the bracket failures, after the weld repairs, after the 14-pound weight additions, altered the firing geometry of the outermost guns. Those numbers that the crews had been flying with for 2 days. They worked. The second wave followed 40 seconds behind the first. Same approach, same altitude. The simulated gun positions that had survived the Beaufighter Pass and the first B-25 wave were destroyed by the strafing runs that preceded the second wave's bomb release. The coordination between the suppression element and the attack element executed within 3 seconds of the planned timing on every single pass. The hit rate across 16 aircraft against 8 simulated targets was 73%. The previous best achieved by conventional high-altitude bombing against comparable targets was 6%. The observers did not speak for approximately 90 seconds after the last aircraft pulled off the target and climbed away. Ramey's second observer, the lieutenant colonel who had described skip bombing as childhood physics, walked to where Gunn was standing and extended his hand without saying anything. Gunn shook it. He did not say anything either. The numbers had said everything that needed to be said. They had been saying it for 6 weeks. Someone had finally been watching at the right moment. Formal authorization came 48 hours later. 16 aircraft, fully modified, crews cleared for operational deployment. Ramey filed no objection. What he filed instead was a request to expand the modification program to 12 additional aircraft as quickly as materials allowed. Kenny later described it as one of the most efficiently written reversals of position he had encountered in 20 years of service. The expansion program began immediately. Immediately meant exhausted mechanics working in 2 shifts on aircraft whose airframes had not been designed to accept the modifications being made to them. It meant fabricating custom parts from materials allocated to other programs and filing the paperwork afterward. It meant Gunn personally training crew members on approach geometry and release timing with 4 days of flight time before the convoy intelligence from Rabaul accelerated everything. The crews who had flown the February 24th test were ready. The additional crews assigned to the expanded program were ready enough. In combat, at wave-top height, with 8 seconds of attack window, ready enough was what they had. Japanese convoy commanders who had survived earlier encounters with modified B-25s filed reports to Rabaul describing an attack form for which their training provided no response. The language in those reports was specific. They were not describing a tactical surprise that new positioning could address. They were describing a physical constraint of their own defensive hardware. Kusaka read those reports. His gunnery officer had confirmed the analysis. The elevation limits were real. The intercept window was 11 seconds. The geometry was the geometry. The convoy sailed anyway. Because Lae had to be held. Because the math said 50% losses were acceptable. Because there was no other option, and the alternative was watching New Guinea collapse without attempting to stop it. On March 2nd, a B-24 reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy through a break in the clouds northeast of New Britain. The 5th Air Force now had the route, the timing, and the coordinates for where Kimura's formation would be on the morning of March 3rd. The modified B-25s were fueled. The Beaufighters were briefed. The crews had their revised release parameters. And then, 12 hours before the main attack, Gun's intelligence officer walked into the planning room with a single piece of additional information that changed the calculation in a way that nobody in the Japanese planning staff had accounted for. The convoy had tightened its formation. Kimura had ordered his ships to close the spacing between transports and escorts, a deliberate choice to maximize the mutual anti-aircraft coverage between hulls. It was the correct instinct for the doctrine under which he commanded. It was the worst possible formation geometry for what was about to happen to him. Tighter formation meant the skip bombs that missed one ship would have a second and third ship behind it in the same bounce path. Tighter formation meant the Arashio, when her captain drove her between the attacking aircraft and the transports in a correct doctrinal response to protect the convoy, drove directly into a geometry where 3 B-25s could concentrate on her simultaneously, while 2 more continued past her to the transports behind. Tighter formation was going to make the attack more effective than the practice range numbers had suggested. In Part 3, we will see what 45 minutes does to 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and the strategic calculation that sent them to sea. We will see what burning oil on the surface of water looks like from the cockpit of a B-25 at wave-top height. And we will see the decision made on the afternoon of March 3rd that historians are still arguing about today, because what happened after the ship sank raises a question that no official history has fully answered about where the line is between military necessity and something else entirely. The convoy is in the Huon Gulf, the skies are clear, and the attack has already begun. In Part 1, Paul Gunn rebuilt a medium bomber into something the Japanese Navy had no doctrine to survive. In Part 2, he fought his own command structure, proved the concept at 73% hit rates, and got 16 modified B-25s authorized for deployment 4 days before Kimura's convoy left Rabaul. The weapon was ready. The convoy was sailing. But ready and deployed are not the same thing. And what happened on the morning of March 3, 1943, in the Huon Gulf, was not a battle in any conventional sense of the word. It was the collision between a defensive system built around one geometry and an offensive weapon built around a different geometry entirely. One of them was about to stop existing. By the time Kimura's radar operators picked up the first contacts on March 3rd, Imperial General Headquarters in Rabaul had already received 3 separate convoy commander reports describing the modified American attack method. 3 engagements, 3 commanders using different language to describe the same physical problem. The pattern was unmistakable. Something had changed in how American medium bombers were being used, and the change was producing results that standard defensive calculations did not account for. Kusaka's staff had analyzed those reports with the specific attention of men who understood that the next major convoy was already at sea. The gunnery analysis confirmed what the reports described. Wave-top approach. 8 forward-firing guns. Skip bomb delivery below the minimum anti-aircraft depression angle. The conclusion required no elaboration. The defensive architecture on destroyer escorts was structurally incompatible with this attack profile, and there was no time to change the hardware before the convoy reached Lae. The Zero fighter modification, flying lower patrol patterns to reduce the 11-second intercept window, was the only available adjustment. It was not enough, and Kusaka's operations officer said so directly in the February 26th staff review. Kusaka approved the convoy anyway. The math said 50% losses were acceptable. The math did not know what was waiting in Queensland. Japanese convoy losses to American air attack had increased 240% in the 6 weeks preceding the Bismarck Sea engagement. That figure represented ships, cargo, and men. It represented supply chains that forward garrisons depended on. It represented a rate of attrition that, if it continued, would make the Lae position untenable, regardless of whether this specific convoy succeeded. Kusaka knew this. He sent the convoy because not sending it guaranteed the outcome that sending it might delay. What Kusaka could not know was that the weapon gun had built was not yet finished being tested against its limits. 8 days before the main attack, the stress fracture crisis in the modified aircraft had forced a recalculation of every release parameter the crews had trained with. The recalculated numbers were distributed 2 days before combat deployment. The crews had 48 hours with revised geometry before the convoy intelligence made the training timeline irrelevant. 48 hours. Against parameters that gun had spent 2 months developing. In combat, at wave-top height, with 8 seconds per attack run. The question nobody could answer until March 3rd was whether 48 hours was enough. It was. At 9:54 in the morning on March 3rd, 1943, the radar operators aboard Kimura's escort destroyers reported high-altitude contacts approaching from the south. B-17 says medium-altitude profile. Known threat. Kimura ordered his gun crews to stations and his formation into evasive maneuvering. His destroyers began the standard interlocking anti-aircraft fire pattern. His zero fighter cover was overhead in the modified lower patrol pattern. Everything Japanese doctrine provided was in place. He was watching the wrong sky. The Beaufighters came first. 13 aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 30 Squadron. Sea level, southwest approach, 220 knots, below the radar horizon, below the visual horizon of every lookout on every ship in the formation. They generated spray trails across the surface of the Huon Gulf from their propeller wash. They were invisible until they were inside 3 miles. At 2 miles, they opened fire. 20mm cannon, 4 cannons per aircraft, 13 aircraft. The outer destroyer screen had gun crews at stations, elevation set for medium-altitude threats. 0 fighters above them flying lower than doctrine had previously specified. The Beaufighter attack lasted 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, anti-aircraft positions on 3 escort destroyers were destroyed before their crews could depress the guns to engage. Bridge personnel on the lead escorts were killed or wounded before coherent warning could be transmitted across the formation. The 11-second intercept window that the Zero pilots had been briefed on assumed the Zeros were already at low altitude when the attack began. They were not. They were transitioning downward when the B-25s arrived. The B-25s came 40 seconds behind the Beaufighters. 16 modified aircraft. 2 waves of 8. Major John Hennessy's aircraft led the first wave. Hennessy closed on the destroyer Shirayuki from 1,500 yards. 8.50 caliber guns. 2,900 feet per second. The bridge crew was killed before the ship's helm could respond. 2 skip bombs bounced once each across the surface and drove into the hull below the waterline. Delayed fuses. The explosions broke the destroyer's keel. From gun contact to bomb impact, 8 seconds. 8 seconds. The Arashio moved between the attacking aircraft and the transports. Her captain understood what he was doing. He put his hull between the guns and the troop ships. Correct instinct. Correct doctrine. 3 B-25s concentrated on the Arashio simultaneously. Her bridge was destroyed. Her rudder jammed. She drove into the transport Nojima at 12 knots. Both ships locked together and burned. The transport Kyokusei Maru had been hit the previous day by B-17S and was already gone. 7 transports remained when March 3rd began. The first wave worked through them in sequence. The Teo Maru, skip bombs below the waterline. Hull opened. The Oigawa Maru, same. The Taimei Maru, same. Each pass, 8 seconds. Each pass, the same result. The anti-aircraft umbrella that Japanese doctrine said would protect the formation was pointing at the high-altitude B-17S that were simultaneously dropping from 7,000 feet, forcing surviving gun crews to divide attention between threats at altitude and threats arriving horizontally at 4 degrees above the water. The B-17 attacks were achieving their historical 6% hit rate. Their purpose on March 3rd was not to sink ships. Their purpose was to keep every gun crew looking up. The second B-25 wave closed on the surviving transports while the first wave pulled off and climbed away. Lieutenant Walter Higgins, flying in the second wave, wrote in his mission report that on his second attack run, he had difficulty identifying viable targets because so many hulls were already at abnormal angles in the water. He selected the transport Ayomaru. Skip bombs, hull opened. 8 seconds. By 11:20 in the morning, the main attack was finished. The burning oil from ruptured fuel tanks had spread across the surface of the Huon Gulf and caught fire. Men who had jumped from sinking transports to avoid drowning were in burning water. Men still below decks when the hulls split were trapped. The oil fire covered 60 miles of ocean. 8 transports sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers gone. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers dead. The 5th Air Force After-Action Assessment compared the March 3rd results against every previous American aerial attack on Japanese convoy traffic in the Southwest Pacific. Previous best single engagement result against a comparable convoy. 2 ships damaged, none sunk. March 3rd result: 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,800 Japanese killed. The assessment document described the improvement as not statistically comparable to previous results because the difference was too large for the same comparative framework to apply. The weapon gun built in a Brisbane hangar had not underperformed its practice range numbers. It had exceeded them. The strategic effect was not immediate in hours. It was immediate in weeks. Within 30 days of the Bismarck Sea battle, Imperial General Headquarters issued a directive that effectively ended large-scale surface convoy operations in the Bismarck Sea. Not reduced. Ended. The directive acknowledged that surface transport under Allied air coverage of the current type could not be conducted without unacceptable losses, and that the strategic implications for the New Guinea campaign required immediate reassessment. Yamamoto received the battle report and said, according to staff officers present, very little. The conclusion did not require elaboration. Japan could no longer move troops by surface convoy to any garrison within range of modified American medium bombers. That range covered every garrison the New Guinea campaign depended on. The supply lines sustaining Japanese positions at Lae, Salamaua, Finschhafen, and across the Huon Peninsula were not degraded. They were severed. Australian ground forces pressing from the south had been fighting against Japanese positions that were regularly resupplied and reinforced. After March 3rd, those positions began deteriorating at a rate that ground commanders could see in real time. Malaria rates that had already been high climbed higher as medical supplies stopped arriving. Ammunition expenditure outpaced what submarine and small boat routes could replace. Units that had been combat effective became combat ineffective without ever losing a major engagement on the ground. The 5th Air Force formally adopted the modified B-25 configuration as standard doctrine within 60 days of the battle. 37 additional aircraft were converted to the modified configuration. The 3rd Attack Group, which had flown the March 3rd mission, continued refining the coordination protocol between the Beaufighter suppression element and the B-25 attack waves. The timing that had been executed within 3 seconds of planned schedule on March 3rd was refined further through 1943 and 1944 until it became automatic. The Royal Australian Air Force crews who had flown the suppression element trained subsequent crews in the specific timing. Those crews trained others. The technique propagated through institutional knowledge in a way that outlasted every individual present on March 3rd. The total tonnage of Japanese shipping destroyed by low-level modified medium bomber attack between March 1943 and August 1945 exceeded 400,000 tons. Supply chains, reinforcements, equipment. None of it reached Japanese forward positions across the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. Paul Gunn received the Distinguished Service Cross. General Kenny recommended him for promotion and described him in official correspondence as the most valuable man in the 5th Air Force. Brigadier General Ramey, who had told Gunn in February that his emotional state compromised his risk assessment, was reassigned in late 1943. His subsequent career was competent. History does not record whether he ever acknowledged what the practice range data had been telling him when he closed the folder. The modification program that Gunn had fought for in Brisbane meeting rooms was now standard 5th Air Force doctrine. The geometry that had seemed like tactical heresy to officers with decades of experience was now the baseline assumption for every medium bomber attack against Japanese naval traffic in the Southwest Pacific. The elevation limits were real. The intercept window was 11 seconds. The skip bomb physics worked at the angles Gunn had calculated. None of this had changed. What had changed was that enough people had finally watched the numbers work in conditions that no amount of institutional conviction could reframe as error. But the man who built the weapon was still waiting for news from Manila. His family had been in the Santo Tomas internment camp since January 1942. The war that his weapon was helping to win still had 2 years of fighting between the Huon Gulf and the Philippines. No amount of distinguished service crosses shortened that distance. Gunn did not celebrate on March 3rd. He was at Charters Towers when the after-action numbers came in. He read the report. He went back to work. In Part 4, we close the account. What happened to the man who built the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific War? What it cost him? What his family found when the camp was finally liberated? And the question that the official histories compress into 2 sentences, but that anyone who has spent time with this story cannot answer without sitting with it for a while. Because the Battle of the Bismarck Sea killed nearly 4,000 men in 45 minutes, changed the course of the New Guinea campaign, and was made possible by a man whose name does not appear in most histories of the Pacific War. The story has 1 chapter left, and it is the one that matters most. Paul Gunn rebuilt a medium bomber with salvaged parts and personal fury. He proved it worked at 73% hit rates against simulated targets. He deployed it against a real convoy in the Bismarck Sea and achieved something the 5th Air Force's own assessment described as not statistically comparable to previous results. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers dead in 45 minutes. The New Guinea campaign was effectively decided before lunch on March 3, 1943. But the man who made that possible was still waiting for news from Manila. And the story of what happened to Paul Gunn after the battle is the chapter that most histories of the Pacific War compress into a sentence, because the official record is more comfortable with weapons than with the people who build them. This is Part 4, the last chapter. And it begins not with a victory, but with a man reading an after-action report in a hangar in Queensland, and then going back to work, because his family was still in a cage, and the war that his weapon was winning still had 2 years of fighting between the Huon Gulf and the Philippines. Gunn received the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony at Port Moresby that he attended, shook the appropriate hands, and left as quickly as protocol allowed. He was 44 years old. Polly Gunn and their 4 children had been inside the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila since January 1942. He had received intermittent word through Red Cross channels that they were alive. Beyond alive, he knew very little. The weapon he had built was changing the course of the Pacific War. His family was imprisoned by the enemy the weapon was killing. Both facts existed in him simultaneously, and he did not resolve that tension by celebrating. General Kenny called Gunn the most valuable man in the 5th Air Force, and meant it without exaggeration. After the Bismarck Sea, Kenny used him on every problem that required someone constitutionally unable to accept that a constraint was permanent. Modified aircraft configurations, low-level attack doctrine refinements, weapons testing under conditions that doctrine said were inadvisable. Gunn worked on all of it with the urgency of a man whose personal deadline was not the end of the war in the abstract, but the specific moment when American forces would be close enough to Manila to open the gates of Santo Tomas. Brigadier General Ramey, who had told Gunn in February 1943 that his emotional state compromised his risk assessment, and then closed the folder on 73% hit rate data, was reassigned in late 1943. His subsequent career was competent and undistinguished. History does not record whether he ever acknowledged what the practice range numbers had been telling him. The modification program he had attempted to stop became standard 5th Air Force doctrine. The aircraft he had refused to authorize were sinking Japanese shipping at rates that altered the strategic balance of an entire theater. The folder stayed closed. The war moved on. On February 3, 1945, American forces liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Paul Gunn and 3 of his 4 children were alive. His son Paul Jr., who had been a teenager when the Japanese occupied Manila, had survived 3 years of internment. The reunion that followed is recorded in accounts that compress something beyond language into the phrase, "He found them alive." Gunn wept. The man who had rebuilt bombers with his bare hands and argued with generals and calculated skip bombing angles at 3 in the morning and personally welded mounting brackets because his welder had a hand infection on day 11, wept in a courtyard in Manila in February 1945 with his family around him. He had spent 3 years building a weapon while they were imprisoned by the enemy the weapon was killing. When that ended, the weapon finally had its full meaning. But Gunn's legacy was never primarily personal. It was institutional, and it outlasted him in ways he did not live to see fully realized. The B-25 modification principle, a forward-firing gun platform delivering ordnance at wave-top height in coordination with a preceding suppression element, did not retire with the Pacific War. It became the foundational logic of dedicated attack aviation for every conflict that followed. The coordinated suppression and strike sequence, bow fighters destroying gun positions before the B-25s closed to release range, is directly recognizable in the suppression of enemy air defenses protocols that modern combat aircraft execute on every strike mission against defended targets. The specific lessons of wave-top delivery against naval targets informed the development of dedicated anti-ship aircraft across multiple air forces through the 1950s and 1960s. The principle that the geometry of attack determines the geometry of defense and that changing one renders the other obsolete has been applied in every generation of military technology since March 3, 1943. The 3rd Attack Group, which flew the modified B-25s at Bismarck Sea, continued operating the configuration through the New Guinea campaign, the Philippines campaign, and into the final operations against the Japanese home islands. The total tonnage of Japanese shipping destroyed by low-level modified medium bomber attack between March 1943 and August 1945 exceeded 400,000 tons. That figure represents supply chains that never reached forward garrisons, reinforcements that never arrived, equipment that rusted on the ocean floor instead of being used against Allied soldiers on beaches across the Southwest Pacific. The number of Allied lives that represents is not calculable with precision. It is large. The skip bombing technique itself was independently developed by the Royal Air Force in the European theater for use against German shipping and shore installations. 2 separate men, working on 2 separate oceans, looked at the same physics problem and reached the same conclusion through the same logical process. That parallel evolution confirms that Gunn's insight was not a quirk of one man's particular thinking. It was a correct answer that multiple people found when they looked at the problem honestly, instead of through the lens of existing doctrine. The doctrine had been wrong. The geometry had always been the geometry. 37 additional B-25s were converted to the modified configuration within 60 days of the Bismarck Sea battle. By the end of 1943, the modification had been applied to aircraft operating across 4 separate air forces in the Pacific Theater: Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, East Indies Command, and the United States Army Air Forces all flew variants of the forward-firing low-level attack configuration that Gunn had fabricated from salvaged parts in a Brisbane hangar. The idea that Ramey had described as tactically suicidal and contrary to established doctrine on 4 separate levels was, within 8 months of the Bismarck Sea battle, standard operational procedure across an entire theater of war. But the deepest lesson of this story is not technical. The technical lesson is straightforward. The geometry of attack determines the geometry of defense, and if you change one, you render the other obsolete. That lesson has been applied and reapplied and will continue to be applied in every generation of weapons development. It is not complicated. It is always resisted. The deeper lesson is what institutions do with inconvenient accuracy. Ramey was not a corrupt man. He was not malicious. He was experienced in exactly the way that makes certain kinds of experience dangerous, because the framework he had built from decades of accumulated knowledge was comprehensive enough to interpret contradicting data as error rather than information. He looked at 73% hit rates from a practice range and saw an emotionally compromised subordinate. He looked at the physical constraint of Japanese anti-aircraft elevation limits and saw doctrine violation. The framework was more real to him than the numbers, until the numbers sank 8 transports in 45 minutes and made the framework permanently irrelevant. Every institution that has ever resisted a correct idea has done so for exactly Ramey's reasons. Not stupidity, not malice. The genuine belief that experience accumulated slowly over many years should outweigh data accumulated quickly by someone who does not yet have enough experience to understand why the data must be wrong. This pattern repeats across military history with a consistency that should alarm anyone responsible for managing organizations through periods of technological change. The radar was dismissed before the Battle of Britain made its value undeniable. The tank was misused through most of the First World War because cavalry doctrine could not accommodate a machine that made cavalry doctrine obsolete. The aircraft carrier was secondary to the battleship in every major navy's strategic thinking, until Pearl Harbor and Midway happened within 6 months of each other and settled the argument permanently. In each case, the correct answer existed before the institution accepted it. In each case, someone who had reason to look at the problem without the comfort of existing doctrine found the answer first. Gunn had reason. His family was in an internment camp. Existing doctrine was not getting the war won fast enough. He needed something that actually worked, and he was willing to ask the question that experience told Ramey not to ask. What if we are pointing in the wrong direction? Paul Gunn was killed on October 11, 1957, when his light aircraft crashed in a storm over the Philippines. He was 58 years old. He had returned to the Philippines after the war, the country where his family had been imprisoned, the country where he had flown commercial routes before any of this happened, and he had stayed. He never wrote a memoir. He gave very few interviews. He did not seek the attention that the modification program should have brought him, and largely did not receive it. His name appears in General Kenny's published memoirs with the kind of sustained admiration that generals rarely express for men below general rank. It appears almost nowhere else in the public record. Here is the detail that the official histories do not include, the one that completes the account in the way that the Distinguished Service Cross Citation and the after-action reports do not. The prototype B-25 that Gunn first modified in Brisbane, the original aircraft on which he mounted the initial gun configuration and tested the concept before any general had been briefed on the program, was still flying in 1945. Not in combat, in a transport role, stripped of its modifications, carrying personnel between Australian bases. Someone had decided the airframe was too worn for frontline use and reassigned it to administrative duties. The aircraft that demonstrated the concept that changed the air war in the Southwest Pacific spent the last year of that war flying colonels to meetings. It was scrapped in 1946. No record was kept of its service history that would have identified it as the original test aircraft. The modification logs from Charters Towers were lost in a records consolidation in 1947. The physical object that Gunn had personally rebuilt, the one he had worked on for weeks with salvaged parts and custom fabricated brackets, and 3 welders who worked without stopping, and his own hands on the welding torch when the qualified man got sick, was cut into aluminum scrap and sold by weight. Unidentified, unremarked, completely indistinguishable from every other worn-out aircraft the Army Air Forces disposed of in the year after the war ended. The idea survived. The metal did not, and that distinction matters more than it might appear, because it is the condition under which most correct ideas exist in history. The insight outlives the object. The geometry survives the aircraft. The lesson continues after the man who learned it is gone. From a commercial airline mechanic with a wrench, a personal reason to win, and an idea that every general in his chain of command initially told him was suicidal, to a weapon that sank 8 transports and 4 destroyers in 45 minutes, and severed the supply lines that sustained Japan's entire New Guinea campaign, to a doctrine that shaped attack aviation across every conflict for the 8 decades that followed. Paul Gunn proved that the most dangerous thing in any war is not the enemy's best weapon. It is your own institution's certainty that it already knows the right answer. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers died in the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943. The New Guinea campaign ended before it formally concluded, and the anti-aircraft umbrella that was supposed to protect the convoy was pointing at the wrong sky because one man in a Brisbane hangar asked the question that the institution had decided did not need asking. He noticed. He was right. That was enough.